Laurie Anderson.
Are we not doing after that?
So, the most obvious question that everybody wants to know, why did you think of this film in the context of Sierra American Valley?
Probably for a lot of reasons that you could think of in terms of a picture of our culture at the moment, and the kind of gloss, I suppose, on it, and the savagery in it, and also the it's also very funny, cartoonish as well. Now, if you, I was just thinking that as well, if, how many people had been offered this film before Mary?
Before Mary, I think Scorsese, Oliver Stone, David Cronenberg, the Canadian director.
Yeah, imagine this as a Cronenberg, or imagine this with
Leonardo DiCaprio,
who is an actor who needs to be liked. This guy doesn't care if you like it. He's really going for this breakdown, this psychotic breakdown. He really doesn't try to make it, it really, and I think Cronenberg also would glamorize this a lot.
Yeah, it's a different
and make the character likable. Yeah.
I think Christian Bale said he got his inspiration from watching Tom Cruise interviewed by David Letterman, and said it was wonderfully attractive and charming, but nothing behind his eyes. And this is really what's on the screen.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, one thing that terrified me when I saw the film again yesterday was that this is supposed to be a little capsule in the 80s, you know, relatively small world of New York businessmen and their entourage. And it seems to me that instead of being something of the past, it's something of the present, this idea of surfaces that, you know, he has a line at the end when he says, inside it doesn't matter. So with the shallowness and the obsession for self and for material, it seems more pervasive now than in that, you know, in the film. It's a microcosm there. It feels today it's even sort of spread. I mean, the idea that this one could be a Broadway musical.
I don't know if we're going to make it to Broadway this one. I don't think so.
It was.
It was. Yeah, but you know what I mean. It's like, I don't know. It's a pretty good picture of the 80s, I think. You know, it didn't seem like really unfamiliar. I did not see this at the time that it came out, though. I mean, I kind of picked this as something that I thought would be interesting to see at the moment, and just to look back into that and see some of the roots of some of the things that are going on. I do have a feeling that we are living in a more savage world than, and that it is becoming more like that. I do feel that. So, and I hate movies like this. I hate seeing chainsaws come out and drawers open and knives gleaming, and this is just revolting to me. But a lot of things are revolting to me, and I try not to just pretend that they're not there and pretend that, you know, and not look at them. So that's, I guess, part of the reason why I chose it. I'm not, although on the other hand, chopping people up is the theme of Greek tragedy and countless horror movies. And if you look at the, I mean, Hitchcock to me is a little bit more terrifying. And then I have to say that on this viewing, the thing I found the most terrifying was what the men were saying about women, rather than the chopping up stuff, which is a little bit cartoonish. The absolute dismissal of women as idiots, you know, it was pretty scary. There are a lot of scary things about this, but it's a complicated film because it's also very lighthearted in a lot of ways. I mean, you really can see I was a product of a broken home, or no, a divorce. Just a lot of lines that you're like, what is going on in this film? And it doesn't help to me that it's just a picture of a man having a psychotic breakdown. Although, and that it's all in his imagination. It doesn't really change it for me. The picture of serial killers is just a little too clear, the patterns and the ideas behind it, looking in the mirror and seeing no one. But the funny part too is just women seeing men in that way. This would be such a different film with a male director, I think. Starting with the number of products that he's putting on his face as he looking in the mirror at the beginning. It's just like that's hilarious. And anyway. But as far as terror goes, I find a lot of Hitchcock really terrifying too. And maybe the most terrifying was reading that Hitchcock Truffaut book. That was basically in the middle of that book. Hitchcock said, the engine of all my movies, what really makes them work, is a really beautiful woman who's terrified in being murdered. And I was like, guess what? That's the last time I'm ever going to see a Hitchcock movie. That's the center. That's the engine of what his movies are about. And we're all kind of, oh, Hitchcock is classic and dreamy and surreal and so on. But he himself said that, and did you, what do you think of that Hitchcock Truffaut book?
Well, the interview, it's a book which is an interview that Truffaut did with Hitchcock. And I love the book, and I love Hitchcock. I normally, but it is true that he has that line, which is quite upsetting. And
do you think that he's just being provocative in saying that, or
I
do you think that's
he was being technical. In a way, it was being technical. He just because he's so much about the mechanism of film and what makes he just sort of figured out that was a trigger. And I think to a certain extent, it's really interesting what she does with it because she shows some of the violence, but she also has a lot of close-ups on the women's face and is deliberate, so that you can actually see the way they're looking at him. And for example, the streetwalker, the second time that she goes in and she just looks at him, she's already been hurt by this guy, and she's disgusted by what she, and his assistant that goes from being almost caring about him to being, it's just an interesting set of choices that she did to use the horror genre from just subverting it a little bit, and I think that. I like very much that about Mary's work in general. She tackles difficult subjects. And, so, I mean, do you see why this movie could go from being, I think, disliked by 50% and liked by 50% to be almost an object of feminist attraction?
The reaction to that, what I find interesting also to be part of the series is that our own reactions to it. Because the initial reaction to the book, Norman Mailer was a great fan of the book and a great defender. And then so you watch this kind of machismo and the sort of like at the very beginning, and everyone else is just straight up nauseated by the book. And then it went through many phases of and it's still a film that people are continuously reacting to in different ways. So that to me makes it a very interesting film, as it's not just dismissed as horror genre and some kind of like period piece of the 80s. It continues to be. So now that the feminists are claiming it, it's also. I think there's something valid about that, especially what you're saying now. Now I'm thinking about these reaction shots of women, and that's very atypical of a horror film, because usually you're not put in this position, and you're basically looking in the mirror with this guy. It's his point of view pretty much, and that device of making you guilty is really frightening to a viewer, because he seduces you with his with his speeches about women's rights and all the things that he's talking about. And you think, oh, this is a big okay guy, and pulls you in, and often in a horror film you're a third person instead of being this first person. So I think that's maybe that's how this film is getting to people more effectively, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was trained a couple of years ago at Film Forum, and the Villain Voice did an essay called Feminine Gaze, which shows how the perception has changed. And I think what's also strong is that it's much clearer that it's in his head. So all these fantasies, he doesn't even enact them, he's delusional. And that's what makes it even more disturbing, I think, that's his way of relating to reality and to the world around him. I wanted to ask you, this is again about the 80s, and I was curious. I wasn't in New York at the time. I just came at the end of the decade. How the art world was sort of interacting with with Reagan, politically speaking. If was there any opposition? What was kind of the relationship in the political system?
To Reagan, I think there was a lot of opposition. I mean, I remember the anti-inaugural ball in 1980. We rented a huge place in Washington where they usually have the inaugural ball, and did a big event there that night. And I do remember really clearly how many people that were talking to these, and they were big, like just their cell phones, and with newspapers like this, and the walls were lined with guys who were talking on their phones, hiding behind newspapers. It was just ridiculous, but it was. It did shock me to see how many FBI people were there, and that taking care of all of these sort of rebellious artists, and so while you have this big coke scene and dance scene, and that was definitely going on, there was a lot of artists who were interested in resistance at that point. I really think there were, and that film has not been made. That's just something in our memories, So it's I'd love to see that actually, because this isn't so far from the '60s. It's a lot closer to the '60s than to other things, and there are still a lot of extremely idealistic people around who were very anti-war and doing a lot of things in the '70s and early '80s. So I think this is the scene I knew, so it seemed pretty accurate in certain ways. It was a pretty wild time, and artists were going. Were part of that. It was a big party scene. Like it is now, it's a big party scene, isn't it?
And I was thinking, and then I'll open to the others, and I was thinking about your show in New York the other night, and how energizing it was, and I was wondering, what do you think of the way that the artistic community is now interacting with what's happening in government and in the American political scene?
It's as an artist, I feel obligated to say things sometimes. I don't think it's necessary. The other thing is, like, if it has two sides, if you think that art is to blame for that the images, stylizing violence is to blame for finding it more acceptable, then you also have to kind of think of whether it's really possible for artists to affect your culture. And so when somebody plans a movie like this for giving people the idea of, well, actually, Hinckley did get the idea, supposedly, from Taxi Driver, when he shot Reagan. So this scene of Reagan in the last part of the film, I'm sure, is quoting that, and the insanity trial, which was, he got off from, basically, he was declared insane, right?
Yes, it was a very insane.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Patrick Bateman would get off on that as well, no?
He would.
Yeah, if in fact any of this was real.
It was kind of pathetic, yeah.
Why do you say pathetic?
Because the way it's portrayed here, he is pathetic, he's delusional. He has delusional grandeur and murder, and everybody keeps thinking he's someone else. They keep calling him a different name.
So he calls himself different names. He's not sure. The identity of
he's desperately trying to make an impact in the most violent, brutal way that one can imagine, and he's not, because not even his lawyer recognizes him. And so that's why I think it's pathetic, and his obsession with himself, and with when they have sex, he's looking at the mirror. It's not, isn't even engaging with the
I
woman.
didn't find that pathetic. I found that terrifying.
Really?
I did. I found him terrifying. And delusional.
Yeah, delusional.
But no less dangerous because he was fantasizing.
Oh no, not as dangerous.
Yeah.
But there is an element of satire that is more apparent than that kind of way.
What did you make of this? I mean, you've probably seen a lot of you've seen it before.
Laurie, you made some great music in the 1980s, still making great music. And I was wondering what you thought of the speeches in the film about, Huey Lewis and Phil Collins, and how it relates to the overall themes of the movie.
That's like John Cale must have had so much fun making this score. Because there was a lot of stuff in it that was just goofy and also cartoonish as well. So I actually liked the score. I thought it was really pushing a lot of buttons. I thought it was really excellent, and his meditations on music are really good as well. So I thought that added to the overall impact of what they're trying to do in the film.
No question?
Or just comments.
Yes,
or
right,
just,
right.
Like reactions.
It seems like that the last scene with the television going to Reagan and the Iran-Contra thing, somehow that whole film has to be connected to that. No, yes?
What do you mean that whole film?
That's what they leave us as the last scene, is these guys talking. One of them was saying, I can't believe Reagan gets away with that, and, the horror and the lies, that whole fantasy that this guy was going through, was it connected to?
It's a film about hypocrisy. So yes, it's a film about American hypocrisy. And the hypocrisy of leaders and the inability of people to see what's kind of going on and also to get lost in this, we don't even know what's real. I mean, for us, to see this film now with our, a post-Karl Rove saying we are, we create reality and you can just adjust to it, is kind of poignant to me. And also, we've gone through an awful lot of serial killers since this film was made in there, and a lot of them are guys who go, I just don't know who I am. And it's all these, white boys and saying it over and over and over. And the hypocrisy see leaders who just go, thoughts and prayers. What's going on? You know, I mean, here's something. Now, we get lost in kind of gun law ideas of, you know, well, if assault weapons weren't so easy, but this guy's got a chainsaw, he's got stuff that's in your kitchen. You know, it's not like possible to eliminate these kinds of weapons. It's not particularly about that. It's about, I think, a million other things of why our culture has become so incredibly violent. You know, how it relates to film is another issue that I don't think that, you know, that we can get into now because it's so complicated. You know, what we're teaching people to do and what we're not teaching them to do or think about. You know, so the narcissism of this film also is something that's pretty haunting. You see that playing out almost 20 years later, and that is chilling on certain levels, and on other levels, you know, I really try to keep it pretty, you know, some kind of distance between works of art and culture. It's very easy to make kind of simplistic comparisons. You know, it's a very different. It's an extremely tricky thing to talk about, but I think it's. I mean, I'm really happy to be paying attention to this film at the moment because it's really making me think of a lot of different things, and I like that. I like to be challenged by something that seems to be one thing you're not so sure what it is. There are even many scenes in the film where I'm like, what is really going on right now? You know?
Yeah, no, I think, okay, hold on, there's a question.
Actually, you've been talking a lot about services and how the film is about services, and I remember the 80s was when Nouvelle Cuisine started and became a big thing, and so much attention is paid to that. I mean, the food is just artifice, and everything is artifice. And it occurs to me that what's pathetic about him is that he's so that his breakdown, his psychic break, is so disconnected because there is nothing past the surface, and so I actually feel sorry for him because because his psychotic break is just about like there is nothing there.
He can't get reservations. That's what really bothers him. It's just not important enough.
But I think that's what's relevant to our time.
Yes, yeah.
Disconnection. And what that means psychologically.
I'll chime in. This is my first time seeing the film. I had purposely avoided it because of its description. But I actually think that he caught the really beginning of the turn of our economic infrastructure, where there was a shift to our primary output is making money rather than things, and all of the psychological, political, social ramifications that has. And I think to a great extent, and it's not my analysis alone, what we are experiencing right now, and hopefully the political reaction against it, was the playing out of this disassociation from a community, from a culture, from things, from values, from one coherent conversation amongst ourselves, to this really sick view of the economic infrastructure upon which everything is based, and then we see the sickness and the disintegration that flows from that. I think that's very much what we're dealing with in the two Americas, and the populism and everything else has grown out of that new shift in modernity, which we need
see it among so many ways to see this, you know.
It was also my first time seeing the film. It felt to me like all of his vulnerability in Patrick's character and all of the men in the film was kind of it was at the time in society when feminism was, it had already kind of peaked, and it was in that period of adjustment, and the powerful white man saw his power diminishing, and it freaked him out. And I think that his character is kind of a freaked out version of the beginning of the decline of the American white male.
There's certainly a lot of like what is the business card sound effect? Japanese swords, right? Yeah. Just let it go. It's the kind of 9-year-old boy kind of thing. Like, here's my business card. Here's mine. Here's mine. You know, it's pretty hilarious. So I don't know if I don't see it quite the way I think you are, but I just like this film because there's so many ways to look at it, you know. And
I think it was a
I can't help but see an analogy with American Gigolo and those beautiful suits and Richard Gere and the Armani and that beautiful apartment and Kim Basinger. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of making that a sound, making that a focus. No one laughed at how beautiful he looked there, dressed, and everyone thought he was just wonderful. It was 1980. And I think he started his career to look like, to be that character.
I just find it also relieved that this wasn't so much glamorized as satirized. You know, so this could have gone very south with a different director. It could have been much more about, evil in the hearts, and sort of glamorizing the wholeheartedness of these guys. So it's more complex this way, I think.
I think you have time for one more.
Giulia, this film was, what year was it made again?
2000.
2000. It's really fascinating at this moment for you to choose this because of the hit film Get Out this year, being a horror genre, and yet all the things that it's saying about society. So for me to see this again is so fascinating. But since I know Guinevere, the writer, what I'm trying to remember, what she said, for her, when the film came out, what she was shocked about, and I don't see why she was the reaction of Gloria Steinem and the group. I mean, wasn't there, protests against it at that time?
Yep.
I think there was.
There were,
Yeah.
the representation of women in the film, and I'm totally down with that. I mean, it was, for me, the head chopping and the head in the fridge is straight up horror movie stuff, But the guys talking about women was really more horrifying to me. Just because it came out of it wasn't part of a cartoony thing. It was really actual kind of behavior of people. So it was more chilling to me than his fantasies of chopping people's heads off.
No, it was groundbreaking to a certain extent. The idea that you can do something, comedy and horror, so tight, so tightly interwoven, and then Get Out is an example where this particular idea of using horror and to make make it political, to discuss some politics is more common, and also to mix it with laughter. It makes people very uncomfortable. That the satire and blood is a tricky mix to actually, I think, sell. Then it's trickier than others. And
it makes you feel guilty. I mean, it plays with you. It plays with you in really tough ways.